Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to first of all thank the organisers of this very impressive conference. First of all, for arranging the important meeting and inviting me to come and share with you some of my thoughts on the roles and the significances and the functions of borders in the contemporary world. It's interesting, but until 5 years ago I'd never visited Korea, and now in the space of 5 years this is already the fourth time I've come for a different type of meeting dealing with borders. And obviously that says something about the interest, not just in Korea because of its own very unique and special case study, but in Asia as a whole, on what the role of borders are in today's world and where we're going with them tomorrow. And I think it's of great significance that we also have one of our guest speakers today is a colleague of mine, Professor Hiroru Iwashita of the University of Hokkaido, who is today the president of probably the most important single group of scholars dealing with borders in the world, the Association of Borderland Studies. It's the first time that someone from the wider Asian area has been president of this important organisation, and I think it says a great deal for how the world as a whole is becoming much more interested in the changing functional dynamics of borders around the world. It goes without saying that if we weren't aware of just how important borders are, then clearly the events of just the past few months and the past year or so in the region that I come from, the Middle East, has thrown that up for all of us to see. We see it every day on the news images, the media images. We see on the one hand the countries of Syria, Iraq, Turkey, where borders which were artificially created just 100 years ago are being challenged and are being overrun. And none of us, even the best politicians and the best diplomats and the best academics amongst us, none of us are able to say what exactly the territorial map of parts of the Middle East will look like 5 years down the road from now. Whether the existing borders between Syria and Iraq and Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey will remain as they are today, or whether they will undergo very significant changes, we simply do not know at this stage. And of course it raises very important questions concerning the long-term stability of borders as part of a territorially fixed world, particularly in a region such as the Middle East, where, as I've already mentioned, the borders were created and superimposed very artificially just 100 years ago at the end of World War I, the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, the concept of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where along came Britain and France and basically determined where the borders should be in that region according to their own geopolitical interests rather than the realities of the region itself. And equally, just in the past few weeks, we see yet again the importance of borders within Europe, within the region, and I'll say something about this in the more formal part of my address, where of course we have believed for 20, 30, 40 years borders have opened, they've disappeared, we have this very strange thing called a borderless world, and that borders are no longer necessary, and suddenly Europe is faced with a very major inflow of migrants, of refugees not just seeking economic betterment, but many tens and hundreds of thousands of refugees fleeing from the instability of the Middle East just to find a safe haven, a place where they can be safe, their families and themselves. And suddenly Europe is saying, well, can we deal with this? Are we able to cope with this? Maybe we need to recreate the borders that just a few years ago we were saying we no longer need. And of course all of us have been watching the news media images of Hungary, of Serbia, of Croatia, of Austria, of the refugees trying to get through the Channel Tunnel from France to the United Kingdom, and we realised that once again borders are being used properly or improperly as a means of preventing the flow, the free flow of movement of people seeking safety. But of course what's interesting today, as opposed to the past, is that we are seeing that the borders are not so efficient. They don't create the sort of obstacles or the barriers that maybe they created 100 and 200 years ago to prevent the movement of people from one side to the other. And we see literally on a daily basis, as we're sitting here, speaking here about the significance of borders, we see that the inability of borders to prevent the movement of people from one side to the other, maybe we should see this as something positive. Because of course in today's world, we no longer live in societies where simply military units or armies just come and say shoot everybody who tries to cross a border, which may have happened in the past. And I suppose it's a very small, very minor piece of consolation to think that that is one of the reasons why borders can no longer be efficient in preventing the flow of these people seeking safety, whether in the short or the long term. I also have to make some more introductory comments and to say that I come to a very unique country, to Korea, where the traditional issue of a physical border is of course so relevant. The division of North and South Korea. And of course, apart from my own very general conceptual comments, I'm not a scholar of Korea. I realise that most of the papers today and tomorrow will address the very specific issue of Korean unification. And yet I come from one of the very few other places in the world where borders are equally important and equally significant. I come from Israel stroke Palestine, where of course we are dealing daily with the issue of borders. I actually live in two different places in Israel. One of them is in the very famous and holy city of Jerusalem, which is right in the heart or in the center of Israel, where the border separating Israel from the West Bank runs through its very heart, although of course it doesn't necessarily exist today. And also in a suburban community near my university in the south of Israel, near Beersheba, and I live literally 3 kilometers south of what was once called the Green Line, or what is now being reconstructed as a separation barrier between Israel and the West Bank. And although the distance, like here, is so small from my community in Meitar to Jerusalem, if I was to drive the most direct route, no more than 75 kilometers, literally going straight through the West Bank, as I do 2 or 3 times a week, I cross the border twice, going into the West Bank and out of the West Bank. And of course I can, like many other people, choose to take what is perceived to be a safer route and avoid the border altogether by driving twice the distance, 120 kilometers, and by that way avoiding having to cross the border into and out of the West Bank. Now there may be many Israeli politicians who say this is only a security barrier, it's not a border, but anyone who has ever been there, who has ever crossed it, who knows what a border is, who sees the documents of the drivers being checked, of some people being allowed to cross and some people not being allowed to cross, well, I think when you look at it in very functional terms, this is a border by all definitions. Of course, the great difference between Korea and Israel and the West Bank is that in Korea, what you aspire to in the future is unification and the opening and the removal of the border. What many of us, not all of us, I have to admit, but what many of us aspire to in Israel and the West Bank is exactly the opposite, is not unification but separation into 2 states where we believe this is the only way forward for some sort of political resolution of this ongoing conflict of Israel-Palestine. Does 2 states necessarily mean there has to be a border preventing movement, this is an open question. But of course the irony or the paradox of the situation today is that there is just Israel and the occupied territories, and for self-stated security reasons on the part of the Israeli government, we have a border even though we don't have two states. So that is one of the great ironies and paradoxes of the situation. But clearly there is a huge parallel between Korea and Israel-Palestine, probably two very micro-regions, small territories relatively, both of whom are grappling and dealing with very clear border issues which require resolving two of the world's micro but very sensitive conflicts on the space of the world today. Having made those introductory comments, I'd like to come to my main lecture and talk about the renaissance of border studies, both within the academia but also within the world of practitioners of the past 20, 30, 40 years. And one of the main questions that I want to ask really is, are borders simple or are they complex? How should we understand the significance of borders? And what I'd like to do is, in discussing with you the renaissance of border studies over the last 30 or 40 years, I hope that some of the questions I raise in a very general or theoretical sense will maybe touch home to many of you who are dealing with the issue of unification, of the significance of the function of the border in Korea, because one of the arguments I want to make is that, I'll come back to this in a minute, is that actually borders are really very, very complex. We like to think of borders as being simple. Just, take a piece of land, two states, put up a fence or a wall in the middle, that's what a border is all about. A few of my colleagues know that I often show these same caricatures, some of you have seen them before, and I actually have a collection of caricatures looking at borders around the world, because I think caricatures often tell you a great deal about political situations, what people are really thinking and sometimes are unable to express openly, maybe are uncomfortable of being politically incorrect sometimes, and often humour and caricatures allows you to express these ideas. Of all the caricatures I have on borders, this is my favourite one, because it's the simplest one. In one sense, it shows borders as being something very simple. Well, let's look at Korea. We have North and South Korea. We have a DMZ in the middle. We have a very highly fortified border zone running along the division. And in a sense, that's a very simple way of looking at a border. It simply is a physical barrier between two countries or two sides who are in conflict with each other. Of course, there are many different ways of interpreting this caricature. One of them is to say, well, look, we have a small country, two people. What is the first thing that they've done? They've created a border between them. This shows us that really we live in a world where borders are somehow part of the way we order society, a natural ordering of society. But then, of course, you could come after a few minutes of looking at this caricature and say exactly the opposite, and say, what do we have here? We have here a small country, let's call it Korea, and suddenly at one point the two people on each side are reaching out to each other. They're stretching their hands across the border, they're about to shake hands, maybe they're going to go down the path of unification, and if we come back in 10 years' time and look at this caricature again, the border will no longer be there. So you can have two completely opposite, binary opposite interpretations of this picture to understand all of the different states that borders can be in, because between those two binary positions, of course, there are many, many other transitional phases of borders and border zones. But then, of course, when we really want to understand what borders are about, we know that borders are really much more complex. Because if we then move from back to my own situation in Israel-Palestine, And this caricature, I'm sure most of you are very aware, is not a recent caricature. If you look at the two people who are on there, these are two people who for quite some time are no longer alive. President Arafat for over 10 years has been dead. Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, in just 2-3 weeks from now, we commemorate 20 years since his assassination. So this goes back to the days of the Oslo Accords, over 20 years ago. And what are the two people trying to do? They're trying to draw a border, the same exercise that we're trying to do today, the same exercise we were trying to do 40 and 50 years ago. But what you can see from this caricature is exactly the opposite of the first caricature. Drawing borders is very, very complex. Because drawing borders is not only about building a simple wall which creates some sort of security barrier to violence, to terrorism, to illegal immigrants. It is a much more complex concept, the border. It touches on a whole range of issues such as identity, belonging, citizenship, economics, movement, freedom of labour, and name it, you can add many more things. In the case of Israel-Palestine, the issue of transportation, of water aquifers, of the building of settlements in the West Bank and how that changes the demographic balance. So borders, in a sense, are very complex constructs. And at that point, I wish to take you in to my main comments and read actually part of the paper I originally prepared for this conference, to look at the way that border studies generally have undergone tremendous growth in the academic discourse of the last 20 and 30 years, and to look at the complexity of borders, to look at the many different ways in which borders affect our lives. Borders have traditionally come from the world of geography, but it is by no means the exclusive concern of geographers. Today, in the Renaissance world of border studies, geographers, political scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, and many other disciplines are interested in the concept of border. And I think that one of the major reasons there has been a renaissance in border studies is precisely because in the Western world, 20 and 30 years ago, we came up with these great notions of globalization, which tells us that borders are disappearing, that we are moving into a so-called world without borders, a borderless world. And borders are no longer significant, they're no longer relevant. And I think many of us within the world, to begin with the social sciences, but it's spread well beyond the world of social sciences, understood that, yes, globalization impacts borders in that their significances, their functions, their intensities are changing as a result of political change in the world. But that doesn't mean they're disappearing. It doesn't mean the world is without borders. That they have many other significances, many other functions which we have to address and which we have been addressing for the past 20, 25 years. And I think it's fair to say in the last 10 years, and even in the last year or two, the very old, traditional understandings of borders, securitization, preventing movement of violence, of people, of other elements, has come back in a very real way, so that in the last 5 or 10 years, we have been reconstructing borders, we have been rebuilding borders, fences and walls around the world to an extent that 20 years ago we thought would never happen again. And I can characterize this by two particular cases. One is to say that we're just about 25 years away from the fall of the Berlin Wall. When we came to 10 years away from the Berlin Wall, there were conferences and seminars taking place throughout the world looking at what is the significance 10 years on the fall of the Berlin Wall. And most of those conferences, academic meetings, like the meeting we're at here today, was all about how we now live in a world without walls and fences, and look how many walls and fences have disappeared. 10 years later on, when we came to 20 years to commemorating the fall of the Berlin Wall, and now the difference between the 10th anniversary and the 20th anniversary was that between the 10th and 20th anniversary, we had a little event called 9/11, and we had 7/7 in London, and we had the bombings in Madrid. Suddenly, borders became important again. And one of the interesting things that was discussed at the 20-year anniversary conferences and seminars of the fall of the Berlin Wall is, what are all the new walls and borders that are being recreated, reconstructed, despite the fact that the Berlin Wall came down 20 years ago? And of course, the fall of the Berlin Wall was not just the Berlin Wall itself. It came at a time when, on the one hand, the walls between East and West Europe, between the Soviet Union and Western Europe, were collapsing, when the European Union was undergoing rapid expansion so that the internal borders of the European Union were falling away. So it was very historically contingent, very politically contingent. And yet, because of the events of 9/11, world global geopolitics underwent a major change, which it still is dealing with and doesn't really know how to deal with. And just 2 years ago, there was a very interesting supplement in the Guardian newspaper which showed the number of walls and borders which have been created since the fall of the Berlin Wall. And let me show you just a few examples. I'm going to rush through and come back in a minute. If we look at walls and borders, so in the world today, and we can look at the United States-Mexico border, we can obviously look at the case here with Korea. In India, a wall of 3,000 kilometers to separate from Pakistan. In Botswana and Zimbabwe, the pictures have disappeared for some reason. Saudi Arabia is constructing a wall. Just in Cyprus, there's a very major wall and zone. And so on and so on. We could keep on running through these pictures over and over to show all the walls and fences which are being built around the world for different reasons that we have explained to a certain extent. Another case would be my colleagues, again, from the Association of Borderland Studies, who originally, it was an organization which really dealt just with the USA-Mexico border. It's now become much more global and deals with much wider issues. But if you ask many of the scholars who looked at the issue of borders from the USA-Mexico perspective, who was funding their research in the 1980s and the 1990s, they would tell you that in order to get a good research project on the USA-Mexico border, you needed to go and speak to officials at NAFTA, North American Free Trade Organization, and they were interested in asking questions about how do you make borders easier to cross? How do you make them more porous for goods, for people, less customs, like in the European Union? How do you make borders less of a barrier and less of an obstacle? But if you ask the same scholars today who is funding their research in the last 10 years, they will tell you it's no longer the North American Free Trade Organization. Today it's the Department of Homeland Security. And the Department of Homeland Security are interested in exactly the opposite questions. They want to know, how do you make borders more difficult to cross? How do you create stronger walls and higher fences and more sophisticated methods of surveillance, not all of which have to be physically located at the border itself, but how do you make borders more difficult to cross? And of course, that shows that like any other major political process, there is an internal dynamics which is very politically contingent, it's very historically contingent, and we have to be very careful, obviously as academics, but also as practitioners and diplomats, of not getting caught up into a very single, exclusive narrative concerning the role and the significances of borders in the world today, because depending on where you are located geographically, depending on what is happening in terms of political and global geopolitics, they may be opening in one place and they may be closing in another place. And I think it's fair to say that today we are dealing with two major narratives in the world of border studies. To a certain extent they contest each other, they compete with each other, but they're not exclusive of each other. One of those narratives is indeed the narrative of the way borders open, the globalization discourse, the borderless world discourse, those issues which were contingent upon the fall of the communist bloc or the opening of the internal borders in the European Union, those places where relative harmony and stability in political terms exist and where it was possible for borders to undergo a process of opening, as contrasted with those places which are faced with very major securitization issues. And here we have to inject a word of caution and say, of course, the definition of what constitutes a securitization threat is very much up to the people who have the ability to determine the dominant narrative. So it's fair to say that in many cases securitization is used by those governments or states that maybe actually want to prevent illegal migrants, economic migrants from crossing, but it's much more acceptable to use the securitization or the threat discourse to justify the construction of new walls and fences than to say, oh, we don't want the poor migrants coming in. And of course this is very politically contingent again, but nevertheless the securitization discourse has strengthened in the past 10-15 years, and what we are finding, and I think anyone who is even cynical about this will see certainly that on the basis of what's been going on in Europe, literally as we are speaking here, literally in the last few weeks and the last few months, is that many governments and many states in the world have to deal at one and the same time with these parallel discourses. It's not that any country can come and say, well, I'm really interested in the opening of borders for economic reasons, for globalization reasons. That's what is going to determine my policy. And it's not that any other country can come and say what determines my policy with respect to the borders is that on the other side there is a threat facing me. It could be a military threat, it could be a terrorist threat, it could be a religious fundamentalist threat, and therefore what determines my policy is the construction of new borders and new walls and the creation of new barriers. Most of the major regions in the world that we are looking at today, if we're looking at North America, if we're looking at Europe and Western, Eastern Europe and of course now the interface between Europe and the Middle East with the flow of refugee migration, most of these regions have to deal with both narratives at one and the same time. Because we no longer live in a world which isn't impacted by globalization. We no longer live in a world where you can become an isolationist state and even conduct your economy as though you're not part of a global reality. And yet many of these same countries don't feel anymore that they conduct their economic relations in a totally open atmosphere if by opening the borders means that they introduce some form of threat, be it a violent threat or some other sort of threat, into their society. So within many of these countries and states in the world, you have, in a sense, a contestation of two narratives at one and the same time. The economists, the globalists, who say we have to have open borders if we want to be part of a global and a world economy, and the security and the military people who say we have to be part of a more secure state, a safe state. We have to create the new walls, the new fences, the new surveillance techniques if we want to be safe. And I venture to even suggest that when these two narratives are put up one against the other, certainly if we look at the last 10 or 15 years, then it is often the securitization discourse which will win out in the eventual decision by presidents or prime ministers or parliaments concerning their policies, because no government wants to be in the situation where at a point in the future maybe a terrorist incident occurred or an invasion occurred, and the opponents turn around and say, well, we warned you that if we don't create a more secure border, this is what is going to happen. And therefore, when they can throw out the narrative of the safety, the physical safety and security of the citizen, that is a very powerful narrative, which can often beat down, if that's the correct term to use, the narrative of opening borders in a globalized world, a world of flows and a world of networks, rather than a world of territorially fixed, territorially fixed states. Again, I come back to my own example of Israel-Palestine, and on the slide you see before you, then there's a very interesting process which is going on. I know that when you look at the media on Israel-Palestine, then, you know, everything is always focused on what is happening in Jerusalem, particularly the past few days, unfortunately, or what is happening between Israel and the Palestinians in the West Bank. But people often forget that Israel has 5 potential borders for an extremely small state, which makes a hell of a lot of noise in the world news and the world media. Israel and all of the occupied territories together is no more than 25,000 square kilometers. But nevertheless, for this very relatively small state, it has potentially 5 borders. 2 of them are fixed and determined. The border between Israel and Egypt and the border between Israel and Jordan, they have become fixed because they are the 2 countries with which Israel shares a peace treaty. And therefore, part of the peace treaty in both of those cases was the demarcation, the delimitation, the drawing of a border on a map, which is then signed by the leaders or the negotiators of both sides as part of the peace agreement, and in most cases the implementation of that border in reality as well. And yet, interestingly enough, it is only in the past 5 years that Israel has actually come to the point where it says we want to build a fence along the Israel-Egypt border. For most of the period since the Camp David Accords in the early 1980s, the line of the border, it was clear to everybody where it was, but there was not a need to draw the actual border, to actually build a fence or a wall. And in the last 5 or 7 years, actually it started not because of the threat of ISIS or Daesh or the Islamic State in the Sinai Peninsula. It actually started because Israel began to receive a flow of migrant refugees coming in from Somalia, Sudan, Ethiopia, and like in so many European countries, I say in parentheses, unfortunately, there was a sort of a movement against this flow of migration into Tel Aviv and so on. So Israel decided to create a fence and a barrier along the Israel-Egypt border, and now of course it's become even more significant because there has been a movement of ISIS in the Islamic State into the Sinai Peninsula. But it means that for 20 years, for over 20 years, since the peace agreement, there was no need to build a fence or a wall along the Israel-Egypt border. And just recently, Prime Minister Netanyahu has 2 or 3 times mentioned the fact that he now believes it is important to complete the fencing in, the bordering, the physical bordering of Israel by building a fence along the entire eastern boundary of Israel from Eilat and Aqaba in the south, along the Arava Valley, the Jordan Valley, and up to the meeting place of Jordan, Syria, and Israel in the north, as he says, to complete the fencing in of Israel. And the question as to why that should be necessary is open to political debate by those who are in favour and those who are opposed to it. 2 other borders that Israel has, of course, is the border between Israel and Syria, which is in the Golan Heights. And if until a few years ago Israel was prepared to discourse or dialogue with some sort of Syrian regime about the future of the Golan Heights, it goes without saying that at this very moment in time, because of what is happening in Syria, it is simply not on the table, it's simply not on the agenda anymore. And of course Israel has a border with Lebanon in the north. And if you add to that the West Bank, the Palestinians, the future Palestinian state, the potential of two states, the green line boundary, the separation barrier, well, for a small country, we've got a lot of borders to deal with. And of course that raises some very interesting ideological questions about Israel's geopolitical location in the Middle East, because one of the arguments made in Israel by many people for many years has been that one of the indications of what it means for Israel to make peace with its neighbours is to be part of its region, to be part of the Middle East. To be part of the Middle East without borders, with open borders, and of course that seems as far away today as it has ever been in the past, and there is no clearer indication of that than the fact that we are building more fences and more walls in what is seen as a means of protecting ourselves, whether that be the correct way or the incorrect way of looking at it. And of course it means that Israel's connection, its geographical and its geopolitical connection with Europe becomes much stronger at the expense of Israel actually being part of the cultural region called the Middle East, although geographically you would say that's where it belongs to a certain extent. There's one more point I want to make about securitization and the construction of borders before I move on to a number of other themes which are very central to border studies today. And, pardon me, and that is to say that if you look at the case of Israel and the West Bank, and you're all very well aware that over the past decade, Israel has constructed what is called a separation barrier, stroke wall, stroke fence. I always say to my students, you can delete whichever term you are most uncomfortable with. I'm not here to make any political point. The wall is actually less than 10% of the fence, and of course the wall is in the places where urban communities virtually neighbour onto each other, and unfortunately the largest parts of the wall are right in and around the heart of Jerusalem, and they're the ugly pictures of the wall separating Jerusalem from Bethlehem, which should be, of course, the epitome of what peace is about, Bethlehem. And of course, when people come as pilgrims, Christian pilgrims, to visit Bethlehem on Christmas, they have to go through lots of security barriers and security checks and walls to get there. But 90% of this separation barrier is in fact a fence, but it's an international border. There are only 5 crossing points, and as I said at the beginning of my remarks, to cross it you have to have the right documents. Palestinians are not necessarily allowed freely into Israel. You have to have the right documents, have the right citizenship. So it is a political border in every functional sense of the word. But why was this border ever created in the first place? Why in the USA-Mexico has there been such a great urge to reconstruct a wall of separation over the past 15 years? Why are we hearing as people like Donald Trump who are coming and saying the most important thing to do is to send all the migrants back to Mexico and to create an impassable wall and so on? Because what they do is they draw out the very basic security fears amongst local populations. They're more or less coming and saying that if we build these walls, we build these borders, we are therefore going to maintain your safety and your security. They speak to a very gut instinct, and they avoid all of the other complex issues we saw in the original caricature about economics, about citizenship, about identity, about belonging and attachment and so on. But what we also forget is that when you build new walls and you separate communities from each other, you may actually, on the one hand, create one form of physical security, but you create new forms of insecurity and fear of threat. When people no longer interact with each other across the border, when they no longer see each other because there's a DMZ, a demilitarized zone, it's not just a wall, but it's a wide zone of many kilometers. When there is a wall and you can't see through it, And if you're a young child who's grown into that reality, doesn't know what the reality is to have an open border, you therefore have a sense, an image of the other side. You have a lack of knowledge. The other side is invisible to you. You don't know what is on the other side. When you lack the knowledge, when there's invisibility, then you are very afraid of what is on the other side because you simply don't know what is there. I'm involved in a project at the moment as part of a big European-funded FP7 project on Euro borderscapes. It includes 21 universities throughout Europe and in neighbouring regions. And in the Israel-Palestine workshop, one of the things that we are in the process, we're nearly completed now, is creating a video of young children, Israeli children and Palestinian children, who have now at the age of 10, in other words, they only know the realities of the separation barrier of the last 10 years. And we ask them to tell us and to show us and to draw pictures for us about what is on the other side of the wall, what is on the other side of the fence. And the images that they create are images of a monster, of a threat, of an alien, which often don't reflect reality. The idea that on the other side of the wall there are families with mothers and children just like them, on one side with Palestinian and Arab identities, on the other side with Israeli and Jewish identities, but nevertheless people with the same daily life concerns, it often doesn't even enter into their mind. I remember going back 10 or 15 years ago when for the first time the wall or the barrier in Cyprus, between North and South Cyprus and Nicosia, was opened for the first time. Today, any of you who have visited Cyprus know, although the border is still there, you can pass through freely. I mean, the border is literally in the middle of a street in the middle of Nicosia where you can just walk down and walk through without any problem. But that was not the case, of course, 10 or 15 years ago. And there was a very interesting article in the New York Times. The first time it was opened, they interviewed a family who lived in the south of Nicosia in a street where at the end of the street there's a wall, there's a barrier. And they interviewed the father, and he says, well, you know, as soon as the border opens, I have got to go and see what is on the other side. All I see from my window every day is the wall. I want to know what these terrible people in North Cyprus really look like and what they think about me. And the newspaper reporter accompanied this person as he went through. He visited the other side. He located the extension of his own street on the other side of the border, and he went there and he saw and he spoke to people, and he came back amazed. And he said, you know what? He said, they look like me, they behave like me, they eat the same food as me, they have exactly the same worries about me. The only difference being is that they don't know anything about me, just as I know nothing about them. So it means that even in an era of globalization, of satellites, of cables, of media, there are still places where borders have a very powerful physical impact upon the micro landscapes and upon the local landscapes. And I think that sometimes we often forget that when we create borders and walls and fences in order to enhance and in order to ensure our physical security and safety, we often forget that at one and the same time we create invisibility, lack of knowledge, and a sense of threat from the other side, which in many senses is just as powerful as the physical threat in the long term, certainly for people, for younger generations, who have never experienced what it means to cross borders. And of course that is always one of the great challenges of unification. I'm sure it will be a great challenge for all Koreans, despite the fact that you are all Koreans and come from the same cultural and historical background. Just to a certain extent, it was a huge challenge for the unification of East and West Germany. And even to this day, of course, I mean, overall, I think we would say, when we look in the perspective of history, it's the transformation that has passed very successfully, but nevertheless, economic differences and other differences in the lifetime of just one generation was so powerful that the border had a great impact. The same can be said for the West Bank border between 1949 and 1967, a period of only 19 years. Prior to 1949, there was a single Arab-Palestinian culture in the region, and the war happened in 48-49, in Israel known as the War of Independence, amongst the Palestinians known as the Nakba, the disaster because it created the Palestinian refugee problem. And in the space of one generation, when they opened the wall or the barrier in 1967, they found that this single Arab-Palestinian society had emerged into two different societies in terms of their economic characteristics, their educational characteristics, and it does indeed show, even in the era of globalization where we're so, I'm going to be very self-critical here about ourselves as border scholars, we tend to be very glib when we talk about borderless worlds and the opening of borders. We forget that these borders and walls have tremendous power and impact in very short spaces of time to create different societies, although at one and the same time, clearly the power of globalization to cross the physical borders, cyberspace, the flow of economic capital, which doesn't pay attention to a wall or a fence, obviously means that those significances are different today than they were 50 or 70 or 80 or 100 years ago. This brings me to another very important point concerning borders, and I'm going to go backwards now, beyond the pictures, and that is to make some comments about the relationship of politics, power, and borders. As I say, border studies has become in itself very cross-border. It crosses the borders between academic disciplines. It brings together geographers, political scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, and many other disciplines. And we then try and ask, what are the themes which link border scholars from different disciplines together? What are the common themes which are important? I think we've long come to a realization that there is no such thing as a single theory of borders. There are a number of people, myself included, who 10, 15 years ago were trying to create a single theory model of borders. There is no such thing, because borders are dynamic social and political processes. The minute we understand that we have to look at them as functional entities rather than simply the physical outcomes of a political process which are drawn on maps, the moment we understand that these are functional and dynamic processes which change according to political and historical contingency, we therefore understand there can be no single theory of borders as such, which links up the many different disciplines, the many different scales, the diverse nature of borders in different places and in different contexts. And of course, borders are not just spatial or geographical, they are vertical and social and religious. They determine what groups we belong to. They're not just spatial or geographical in any sense, although we normally tend to focus on the borders separating states one from each other. We do come back to the question, which is, what is the nature of power relations of borders? Who creates borders, and for what purpose? Whose purposes do they serve? And I think, to a certain extent, when we were discussing a few minutes ago, the parallel narratives, the opening of borders and the closing of borders, the globalization discourse and the securitization discourse, we, without actually saying power relations, that's what we were talking about. Are borders the product of governments? Are they part of a top-down process where governments determine, for security reasons, we are now going to build a wall and a fence? Or do they often come about as a result of bottom-up relations, which often is the opposite process, the movement beyond borders, the creation of trans-border regions, transition zones, borderlands, Many different terms are used to define this, but a zone on each side of the physical line where people do have minimal interaction with each other, even though the border exists. And that may be for economic reasons. It may be, as in many cases in the world, where we have cities or towns on both sides of the borders, and for the efficient functioning of the municipality, we need cooperation across the borders. It may well be for reasons of tourism. I can think of Eilat and Aqaba at the south of Israel, where there is a peace agreement between Israel and Jordan. Nevertheless, relations are still very tense because of the wider Israel-Arab conflict, and yet one of the areas where, of course, it's been very important to cooperate has been in the area of tourism in a very small region. We think of Israel and Jordan, but actually there are 4 borders there. There's Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia, all with borders very close to each other in a very, very small region at the head of the Red Sea. And there's another very important area where bottom-up relations between peoples on both sides of a border come together, and that is for environmental reasons. Certainly in the case of Israel-Jordan, some of the more successful cross-border projects, and I have to say that unfortunately there was a period in the 90s where there were quite a number of projects, but because of the renewed tensions within the Israel-Palestine arena in the past 10 years, unfortunately it is now more difficult to undertake cross-border projects, and some of the existing projects have fallen apart. But where actually are the most important projects in the case of environment? And it's based on a concept, which I often argue. The concept is that mosquitoes don't need visas. The mosquito bites you in your house at night when you're trying to sleep. Doesn't matter whether you're on the Israeli or the Jordanian or the North or the South Korean side of the border. If you don't deal properly with the environment and the waste and the effluents, then the mosquitoes are going to be there, and there's no way that any border is going to stop them from coming into houses on both sides of the border. So often there are bottom-up processes which affect the quality of life of people, which have nothing to do with politics, has nothing to do with national identity and national citizenship, but which actually impact regular people on both sides of the borders in their daily life practices, and that is often the pressure which is exerted on governments who determine policy to create a new way of managing borders, and this can in itself lead to the opening of borders in the long term. It's very interesting that in the European Union, as the European Union expanded, as it enlarged, as more and more borders came down, from 6 to 12 to 18 to 27 states, one of the most important agencies of the European Union was actually its border management authorities, which understood the need a long time in advance to create trans-border regions enabling cooperation, cultural affairs, economic affairs, simple travelling, of peoples on both sides of the borders, so that when it eventually came to the day where the border was open and was removed altogether, it was no longer suddenly something very shocking or sudden. People had already come to understand that actually, functionally, this was very capable, this was very possible, this was a potential, and I think this was a very important, remains a very important aspect of EU policy towards those countries which come into an enlarged European Union and where eventually the borders are removed. And of course the most significant border, at least until the recent migration and refugee crisis, has of course been the Schengen border, which really determines the functions of the external border of the European Union between the EU and Russia, and between the EU and other states which are not yet members of the European Union. There's another dimension, before I conclude, which I think also is very important, that is to say, coming back to what I said about power relations and the bottom-up processes, and that is to say, of course, it is at the micro dimensions that borders can be very significant. I remember this is going back almost 20 years. Before we had this whole debate about borders, I remember the BBC preparing a series of documentaries on 9 or 10 frontier regions in Europe. And they came to people, well-known artists or poets, who had grown up in border regions, and they asked them to write their own script. What did the border mean to them in their lives as they grew up? What significance or impact did it have upon them? And everyone was given a totally free hand to write their own script. And there were 2 or 3 very interesting anecdotes that came up, such as the guy who grew up in a village on the Spanish side of the Spanish-French border in the Pyrenees. And he said, you know when the border became significant for us? Once a month, my parents decided we wanted a really good meal, so we crossed over into the French side of the border. Now, I hope there's no Spanish people sitting here. It's not meant to be in any way critical of Spanish cuisine, but this was his definition of what the border meant to him in his life. Much later, there was the case of when Ireland, where of course the north is still part of the United Kingdom, and the Republic of Ireland, the south of Ireland, is an independent country, and this is going back literally in the last 10 years, where of course the border has now been removed. Anyone who goes to Ireland today drives quite freely from one side to the other, but even though you drive from one side to the other, you have to change the currency from euro to sterling. And there are many, and the status of the roads, the nature of the road signs are different, literally, as you're going along the road, because they're prepared in a very different way. And one of the more amusing anecdotes is that when countries started bringing in the ban of smoking in restaurants and even in pubs, the ban was brought in the Republic of Ireland before Northern Ireland. On the other hand, any of you who know anything about pub culture know that until a certain period of time, in the United Kingdom, pubs had to close at 11 o'clock at night. And then opening hours were extended all day long. The Republic of Ireland extended their opening hours long before the United Kingdom. So there are anecdotes which sound amusing, but actually they're very significant in the impact of borders on your daily life, of people who lived in villages on the Irish border, when the border is now open, who said, well, you know what, we start drinking in the evening by walking up the road into the United Kingdom, into the pub on the other end of the street, where we can still smoke inside the pub. We don't have to go outside into the rain and the cold. But when the United Kingdom, at 11 o'clock at night, says you have to close the pubs, we then walk back down the street to the southern part of the street, where we're open all night long and we can continue having a drink and a social with our friends, even if we can no longer smoke inside the pub. Now that sounds tremendously insignificant, and yet it shows the powerful impact, because many people spend their evenings, this is their way of social gathering in the evening, and therefore it had a tremendous impact on their daily lives. The fact is that today everything is now the same. Today you can no longer smoke in pubs on either side of the border, and they're open all hours of the day on both sides of the border, so that difference no longer exists. And here I want to come up with 2 concluding comments. One is to say something about borders and difference, and then to make a conclusion. Looking at these, in a sense, insignificant elements, cuisine, opening of pubs, and I could bring you many, many other stories, such as the people in Holland who say, well, we send our children to school in Belgium because the schools have a much better sense of discipline there. Therefore we cross every day without even noticing that the border is there anymore. One of the mistakes we've made in border studies is to assume that when you open borders, you create the removal of difference. What I said about the pubs in Ireland may be true, but you don't create a sense of difference, because when you look at all the research that is done on people who cross borders for the first time or continue to cross open borders, the border is still there. It's not physically there. It's not an obstacle, it's not a barrier. But Belgium and Holland and Germany and France and all the surrounding countries still have their state territories. They begin and end at certain points. Citizenship and taxation applies to you depending on your geographical location vis-à-vis the border. When you ask people, what did they do at the weekends, they'll tell you, well, you know what, we drove into Belgium and we had a good meal, or we drove here and we got cheaper gas prices. What in a sense they're saying is that borders are still very significant. It's just that difference is something to be enjoyed, to be exploited for your own benefit. It's not something to be feared anymore. It's not to be feared because it's open to us. It's available to us. We can cross the border and we can experience it. We can have cheaper gasoline prices, better meals, better schools, and then we can come home in the evening and we've had no sense of fear or threat. So actually, the opening of borders makes the encounter with difference something very positive, something to be enjoyed, even something to be celebrated rather than something to be feared. And that is one very important point about the opening of borders, perhaps even the unification of societies. The final point I want to make, and with that I'll close, is to say that clearly border studies as an academic discipline cannot be just an ivory tower discipline. It is something which obviously bears relations to practitioners, diplomats, politicians. There is a two-way process going on here. Certainly in the case of Israel-Palestine, I've been privileged in the past to sit in track 2 discussions where we've looked at maps and where we've tried to draw up borders which can have an input into the political process. Of course, political decisions at the end of the day are made by politicians, not by academics. But academics have the ability to create a database of knowledge to show the dilemmas and the contestations which occur from opening borders or closing borders, of creating fences, of allowing movement to take place for economic reasons, for cultural reasons, for tourist reasons. And I believe that is a very important message. It's a very important interface between the world of scholarship and between the world of practitioners, where each can feed onto the other in the hope of creating a world which lives in a more peaceful situation, where we live in a world where we don't need to create the new borders we are creating today, because we have a much greater sense of stability, of harmony, and maybe even unification. Thank you.
혹시 질문이 있으신 분 계시면 저희가 시간상의 문제로 딱 2분께만 질문을 받도록 하겠습니다. If you have any questions due to the time constraint, we get only 2 questions from the floor. Please raise your hand if you want to make a question.
끝났어. 끝났다고.
Everything's so simple.
올라와. 계시.
Well, it's very intimidating to be one of the 2 questions. So thank you very much for this very dense and very long talk. And I'm going back to the 2 narratives you referred, the narrative of borderless world and the narrative of the securitization. And at the beginning of your talk, I got the impression that you view them as a diachronic event after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So first narrative emerged, and then after 9/11. But then at the end of the talk, you suggest that they are actually the same, 2 sides of the same coin, so to speak. And so I was wondering if you view this more as a diachronic thing or as a synchrone, 2 facets of the same ideological views on borders by different actors, economic actors on one side and more religious actors on the other side?
To a certain extent, yes. I think there are two facets with different actors. Although, of course, if we relate that to the issue of power relations, then we often forget as well that when we spoke about the opening of borders, one of our natural assumptions 30 years ago was to assume, well, power has shifted within many of these societies, therefore different people are coming and opening the borders, when in fact we often forgot it was the same power elites who in the past had closed the borders for their own interests, who are now opening the borders for other interests because they wanted to remain in power and they understood where public opinion was shifting and changing. I think, of course, it's very simplistic to say, well, this started, with the fall of the Berlin Wall. This started with 9/11. These obviously are critical dates in recent history, but of course it doesn't work like that. The whole concept of the flow of economic capitals, the introduction of internet and cyberspace, which circumvented borders, a lot of different things came together in a certain period of time. But I do think what did change, I do think that 9/11 and what has happened since 9/11 has been a very important change with relation to borders, because until that point we were only thinking in terms of a single discourse, rightly or wrongly, but we were only thinking in terms of the way borders are opening and disappearing, and we had this very strange concept of borderless worlds. As I say, there are obviously different power interests, and I think they contest with each other at one and the same time. There's no one society which can come and say, we just adopt one of these narratives, because, as you know from this second slide, because once you look at that slide, you understand that includes globalization, and it includes securitization, and it includes 100 other things as well. And what I was trying to say was that those two narratives are, in a sense, as you say, the binary, the polarized sides of a very long continuum, on the continuum of all those other lines which you see there.
Okay, is there any other question? 질문 한 분 더 받을까요? 네.
I enjoyed the presentation. It's really, the board is simple as well as complex. Well, comparing to two different borders in Israel and Korea, you have one border demarcation, and Korea is a distant border, and both sides you emphasize the narrative of economic narrative and military narratives, and even in Korea, both sides have their own narrative for the need of unification, but there is some difficulty who initiate the theme of the narrative, in what direction? That is very political and cultural and very hegemonic. You think even in Israel and Palestine, and what we see from distance from Israel, what was transmitted by communication, news media, is a totally different version. Netanyahu and the other side, we simply sympathetic, at the same time very angry. At the same time, Korean, both sides, we, South Korean, hear North Korean narrative is totally different from political leader, as you might understood what our chairman of assembly, in the speech of congratulation, he also made a beautiful narrative for future. I would like to hear from your response about general pictures.
Yeah, well, of course, I want to be very careful about making the comparison. Or the only point I was really making to say was that, I was coming from one very intense border region to another very intense border region, where borders haven't disappeared from the political discourse over the last 20 or 30 years. They've only intensified, but maybe in different directions. But I think your question really brings us back to what I was trying to say about power relations and power elites. Because at the end of the day, there is power hegemony. There are groups that I can't speak for Korea. I don't know the different discourses here, but I can certainly speak for Israel, Palestine. I can speak just for Israel. Within the Israeli side only of the conflict, there are 3 or 4 different discourses as to what the future situation should be. Should it be 2 states? Should it be a single binational state? Should it be the continuation of occupation? And every one of those has implications for should there be a border and what type of border should there be. And let me give you an example. The general consensus is that if there was to be conflict resolution in Israel-Palestine, it needs to be around the concept of 2 states. 2 separate territories with 2 peoples, each independent within their own territory. That is it sounds very simplistic. It's very problematic to implement, even increasingly problematic today. But the question is, can you find me a better solution? Is it the best of all the bad solutions? Now, there are 2 groups who will tell you there are other solutions. There are the right-wing extremists in Israel, including the settlers, who say, we don't believe in 2 states. We want to settle the whole of the West Bank. We believe that this land was given to us by God in the Bible. This is our land. We should be sovereign, and one day we will annex all of the territory. There will be total Israeli Jewish sovereignty over all of the territory, a single state. You have the left wing, the radical left in Israel, including and also many of the Palestinians, who say, we don't believe anymore in 2 states, it's impossible to implement. We should have, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, a single, binational, democratic, secular state, which is neither Jewish or Arab, but is a state of all of its citizens. Now, they are 2 diametrically opposed political positions, but they are similar in one respect. They both see the whole of the territory as a single territory with no borders. They both reject the concept of the 2 states. The power relations within each of their solutions is completely the opposite. The right-wing solution is that the Jewish people are the sovereign here. The left-wing binational state is that everybody is equal here. There is no group which is sovereign or powerful because of their ethnic or religious identity. But they both see it as a single territory without the need of borders. And you know what? There's a lot to be said there. I'm a great believer in the need for 2 states because, as I said, I see it as the best of all bad solutions. Although I don't know how you implement it today. Once I thought I knew how to implement it, it's become very complicated today. But nevertheless, there's a lot of logic behind saying you can't implement it today. How do we think beyond the territorial box? How can we create a sharing of power that both people feel that they are governing themselves without the need for territorial separation? That is a very difficult question, but it's a very real question out there on the table today because there are many of us who believe in 2-state solutions. This is a political hegemonical position, 2 states, but we no longer know how we can implement it. So it does come back to changing conditions, and as you rightly say, it very much comes back to who is the power hegemony, who has the ability to dictate which of the different narratives is the one that is going to determine the policy at the end of the day.